Jack Parsons actually ran one of Aleister Crowley's organisations out in California, in I think it was San Bernardino, I think. And so, in other words, Parsons was this guy. He was a very brilliant rocket scientist, but before every rocket launch, bear in mind this is in the 1930s when rocket flights and research was very much in its infancy. Before every rocket flight, he would invoke the god Pan, the Greek god Pan, to try and ensure a successful flight. And bear in mind that the military were actually contracting him to do this work. So in other words, you had the military using one of their major rocket scientists to do research for the armed forces, who actually happened to be an occultist and a follower of Crowley. So in other words, you have this crossover way back to the 1930s and the 40s of the military having an interest in the occult. And it seems to be the way, that's how the group started, because there was this crossover between Parsons having literally had a top secret clearance with the Army, Navy and Air Force to work on all their projects. And every year on Halloween, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, they hold what's called Nativity Day. And you can see this on the internet. I think there's some of it on YouTube, where they hold this, it's basically like a party in Jack Parsons' honour, and they bring in mannequins and dummies dressed up like Parsons and all his different personnel and friends, and they basically toast him with drinks that, if it wasn't for Parsons, there probably wouldn't have been a NASA of the type that exists today. And yet, who they're actually toasting is a guy who ran this occult lodge in California and invoked, I guess, Greek gods and all sorts of things on his rocket flights. So again, you know, we have this crossover, and also during the Second World War, Aleister Crowley was used by British intelligence to try and fool the Germans with things like fake astrological predictions and things like that. The Nazis were sort of very much into, you know, astrology and trying to determine how the war was going to go, and so they would use people who claimed to see the future, etc. And the British intelligence tried to use Aleister Crowley to deceive the Germans and, you know, say, well, I see war breaking out over here, and so you need to send your troops that way, and then it was sort of like diversionary tactics. So all these people engaged in early occultism, like Parsons and Crowley, had also been used by the military in different ways. And what I was told is that because Parsons followed on from Crowley's teachings, what happened was that Parsons engaged in his own sort of ritual to try and conjure up something like this in 1946 and continued right through the summer of 1947. Now, of course, the summer of 1947 was when the whole flying saucer subject broke, when Kenneth Arnold saw these 9 sort of delta semi-disc shaped objects flying over the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, and he said they flew like a saucer skipping across water, and that's how the term flying saucer was created. So this was in the summer of 1947, right at the time when Parsons had tried to, as he said, open the door further to the door that Crowley had supposedly opened. Now, what made this think tank group, which was formed around about this time, conclude again there was sort of this demonic angle, was that Jack Parsons actually met Kenneth Arnold. And the way in which he met him was because Jack Parsons was, as I said, he's a noted rocket scientist. And he had a mutual friend named L. Ron Hubbard. And L. Ron Hubbard was the man who formed the Church of Scientology. And L. Ron Hubbard and Parsons worked together on these particular rituals in the summer of 1946 and later on. And L. Ron Hubbard wrote science fiction, and somebody who was well known to L. Ron Hubbard was a man named Ray Palmer. Ray Palmer published several famous science fiction magazines in the 1940s, and Ray Palmer actually co-wrote and published Kenneth Arnold's book on his UFO sighting in 1947. So you had this link from Jack Parsons to L. Ron Hubbard to Ray Palmer to Kenneth Arnold, and that's how Parsons and Arnold got to meet and know each other. So, in other words, they were sort of the group was putting strands and pieces together that seemed in their minds to suggest that the whole modern era from Arnold in the summer of 1947 could be traced to, I guess, the work of Aleister Crowley followed on by Parsons in 46. And then the further they dug into it, they started talking then about the whole contactee era. Now, the contactee era, for those who aren't aware of what it is, in the early 1950s, you had a lot of people around the United States and all around the world who claimed contact with very human-like aliens. And the people who claimed the contact became known as the contactees, and these aliens became known as the Space Brothers. And unlike the ones that look like this, the Space Brothers were described as very human-like, so with heads of long blonde hair, which, you know, for a woman wouldn't look out of place at any time, but in the 1950s, you know, to see men with hair down here, sort of bright blonde hair, would stand out as being strange. And so most of the experiences that people talk about with the Space Brothers, they assume that they all follow the same motif, where in a lot of the cases the contactees would feel driven or drawn, if you like, to go to remote locations like deserts, hilltops, forests, and not really knowing why they were going out there, but then to have these encounters with these human-like entities where they would be like a philosophical discussion on different subjects, where the aliens would say, we want you to disarm your nuclear weapons, etc., and live in peace and harmony. And a lot of the contactees literally felt sort of transformed overnight in terms of their mindsets and beliefs, and began writing books and going on the lecture circuit. Now, that's sort of the typical archetypal image that we have of the Space Brothers and the contactees. What a lot of people don't know is that not all of the contactee experiences occurred in that situation. Now, one of the most famous contactees was a man named George Hunt Williamson. George Hunt Williamson wrote a number of UFO books before vanishing from the scene in the late 1950s, and then he died in the mid-80s. But he claimed that many of his experiences weren't undertaken by going out in the desert and meeting these aliens. He said his contact was made by Ouija boards, and literally nothing else. And his view was that, you know, he would sit at the table, put his finger on the board, and the little planchette, as they call it, would move around, and he would get messages from the aliens that way. Well, the think tank group, they believed that Ouija boards were evidence of demonic dabbling, and so here was further evidence of linking somebody, a well-known person in the UFO subject, claiming to be receiving alien messages, but actually getting them through a Ouija board, which the group concluded was evidence of deception. Now, on top of that, certainly the most famous contactee was George Adamski. George Adamski wrote a number of books on UFOs. His first book, Flying Saucers of Landing, published in 1953, and its first printing sold 125,000 copies in America alone, which, you know, is sort of unheard of in UFO book terms today. And he wrote this book, which again described his contactee type experiences. Now, Adamski wasn't the greatest writer, and so he had a co-author on the book named Desmond Leslie. And actually, what a lot of people forget or don't know is that Desmond Leslie's name actually appears before Adamski's on the book. You know, the story was Adamski's, but it was written definitively by Desmond Leslie. Well, Desmond Leslie's father, Sir Shane Leslie, was a deep follower of the occult, and he was actually trained in the teachings of Aleister Crowley. So again, here was somebody else they were looking into, where his background and his roots had a link with Aleister Crowley. And by the early 1950s, they were making all these connections, suggesting that, wow, you know, there's something going on here. If it was just nuts and bolts UFOs, why would all this be linked back to people like Parsons, Aleister Crowley, and this being land? And this is when, in the early 50s, I mean, prior to that time, late 40s, early 50s, they were just, as they openly admitted, they were putting strands together and trying to figure out what was going on, and seeing a picture but not really understanding it. But by the sort of mid-50s, pretty much all the members of the group, which at the time was probably only about 15 people, as far as we can tell, it was first officially established in the early part of 1952. What it seems to be the case that happened was that in the late 40s, when the whole UFO thing broke out, various people in the intelligence community and the military that were interested but weren't involved in officially investigating it, in one particular place out in California, they would get together and sort of hang out, as one of the people described it, over martinis in a bar, and discuss what was going on in the UFO subject. And they they came up with some interesting ideas like this. And then at some point in the early 50s, somebody within the government who was involved in sort of funding various obscure think tanks in all sorts of different areas said, you know, these guys have got some interesting areas of research, and the ongoing UFO projects that exist right now, they're not having much success with them. You know, there's Project Blue Book and Grudge, which were looking at like pilot reports and radar reports, but they weren't sort of getting the answers, you know, they were just collecting more data. And they were saying with the CIA's Robertson panel, they don't seem to have solved anything, they've just offered their opinion. Why don't we ask these guys if they want to leave their regular jobs in the military, and for like a few years we'll fund them as like a think tank body to look into this whole demonic occult angle further. And that seems to be how it was set up, that they were literally offered a position of, hey, you know, you did do some good work, albeit off the record in your own free time. We're here to offer you, you know, X number of dollars funding to do this indefinitely, or until, you know, we may get some answers or not. And so that was the situation in the 1950s. Now, of course, things kind of changed radically in the 1960s when alien abductions began. Can we have the next picture? Now, that's a man named Joe Jordan, who I'll tell you about in a moment. But the group itself, as far as we can tell, throughout the latter part of the 1950s, there may not have been that much work done beyond just sort of collecting data on UFOs and trying to interpret it in this occult, demonic fashion, which by then, by the late 1950s, the several surviving members of the first incarnation of the group said pretty much everybody by that time had come around to the notion that even if these things were aliens, they seem to have a role in the occult world as well. And some people felt that they were definitively demonic or occult entities. Others felt that they tapped into some sort of ancient, archaic power or knowledge that we've forgotten or lost about today, and that they were using technology as much as they were using occult rituals, you know, sort of like a blend of modern day science and ancient alchemy and things like that. But by the 1960s, things began to change when we had the Betty and Barney Hill so-called alien abduction case of 1961, when the Hills were returning from Canada, being on holiday, and reported this strange experience where it wasn't quite like today's abduction stories, because part of it they did remember consciously when they got home, and immediately they realised there were several hours of time missing. And they knew they'd seen a UFO. That was all. They always remembered that consciously. What they didn't remember consciously, and what came out in dreams and nightmares later, was being taken on board the craft and experimented on, etc., in the same scenario as today's alien abduction stories. Well, the group, the think tank, then began to realise that there seemed to be a new aspect to the UFO subject developing, that was far removed from the whole space brother, long-haired alien scenario of 10 years earlier. And so what they did, they began to look at these cases as well, and like all abduction researchers have done, they realised that there seemed to be several trends, that there seemed to be interest in sort of human reproduction in the abduction stories of hybrid babies and things like that that look half human and half alien, that there seemed to be a medical experimentation angle, and that a lot of the people who were taken seemed to be like young women, young men, and that after a certain age the abductions seemed to stop, as if it was sort of related to sort of reproductive process and time frames, you know, human lifespan, etc. And they sort of quietly collected information, and we actually have some of their files which I've reproduced in the book, how they specifically approached the Defence Intelligence Agency here and the British Ministry of Defence in England, and literally said, you know, we're working on a project. And they didn't actually go into details specifically. They said, we're working on a project where we're trying to determine how many UFO cases are out there, and if you're getting any through official channels, where young women have been abducted from their homes, or they didn't actually use abducted, they used the term kidnapped, and reportedly taken on board a UFO, either from their home or from their car. And they actually collected a number of reports, sort of a file about this thick, where people had claimed driving home late at night, and then they'd had this experience of being taken from the car and replaced back in the car later, and then having these weird dreams. So in other words, they were seeing this phenomenon developing, but from their perspective, the challenge was, well, how does that relate to the demonic angle, or does it? Or is this just some totally different phenomenon? You know, are the Greys totally separate to the so-called Space Brothers? Is it just a completely different phenomenon? They continued to collect reports from it for a number of years. And one of the things they found was that in a number of UFO cases, abduction cases, and you can actually find these, quite a few of them, in the books of John Mack. John Mack was killed a couple of years ago in a car accident. Or was actually hit by a car, I should say. And his books, one was called Abduction, I forget what the other one was called now. But basically, in his books, he interviewed a number of abductees who said that when the people were abducted, although the entities seemed to be alien, the people got this sort of distinct feeling that these were almost like psychic vampires that were trying to steal their soul. But that's literally how the abductees described it to John Mack. And people like Whitley Strieber, in a number of his books, he concluded that there seems to be some connection between abductions and the human soul that goes beyond just prodding and poking us and taking DNA, etc. There is a sort of conventional view that many people have, that it's, you know, it's like an alien genetic program. And the group itself came around to this ideology as well, if you like, the notion that abductions seem to be more, or paradoxically less, than you would assume in a normal abduction scenario. And they, at the same time that they were looking into abductions, they were looking into the whole issue of life after death as well. And we know that government agencies have officially sponsored research into things like out-of-body phenomena and near-death experiences. You know, when people have had, say, a car accident and they die for a minute or two, and the doctor brings them back, and in that couple of minutes they report leaving the body or seeing lights and shadowy figures and things like that. Well, one of the cases that the group got hold of was a man named Paul Garrett, a man who was badly injured in a car accident in California in the late 1960s. And this guy Garrett had actually written a letter to his newspaper, his local newspaper in California, talking about how he had this strange experience, and the newspaper published it. And he basically said, you know, he's driving home, and I think another car slammed into his, and he was very badly injured and actually died briefly in the hospital. The doctors brought him back, but he said when he was in this sort of semi-dead state, I guess, if he could be semi-dead, he talked about how he felt he'd literally sort of been to like a gateway to hell. But he said it was nothing like described in sort of conventional biblical teachings. He said it was almost like another realm or dimension where his soul had gone. He said it was like a very flat, never-ending landscape. And he said there were all these other presumably dead people there who he said were kind of just like shuffling around like zombies. But he said there were these sort of small flying saucer type devices high above them. And he described them as sort of moving backwards and forwards very, very quickly, like worker bees, like just giant mechanical insects. And he said that every time they would hover over these shuffling people, like a ball of light would fly out of them and it would get sucked up into the UFO, which sounds like a bizarre story, you know, but the group took it as, no pun intended, as gospel. You know, they accepted it that, wow, you know, this is what's going on. And they actually concluded that these entities using abductions are trying to understand the nature of the human soul so they can steal it. And they spoke to a number of people who claimed similar near-death experiences, who said that they died and seen these. The best way I can describe it is, has anybody here, or most people, ever seen the Matrix film? Yeah. Well, you know when at the start life looks normal and then suddenly Keanu Reeves wakes up and he's in like this tank, and it's like the real world that we think is just a hologram, and we're actually just, everybody's just miles and hundreds of miles of everybody laid out in pods where essentially human beings we're all just being farmed in a giant factory by these machines. The group came to believe something similar, that these entities that we call the Greys are literally like soul vampires, and they derive a form of energy from the human soul. And the group concluded that the whole point of their presence here is that the earth is like a farm, and that they farm human souls on death for food. that's sort of their bleak, literal belief system. And they conclude that's why the quote aliens don't land, because they don't want to destroy us because we're food. They don't want to teach us anything because what is there to teach us? They just want us to be maintained. And they kind of made the analogy in one of their documents. It's like the farmer looking after the cattle. The farmer doesn't hate the cattle, but he's by necessity, he uses them as a food source or sells them to the market or whatever. But he doesn't hate them, he doesn't try and kill them. He actually makes sure that they have a nice life, because the healthier they are, the better the reward at the end. And they viewed it as a similar thing. Now, as I said at the beginning, this isn't my view, and I don't want to sort of... A number of people, actually, when I mentioned this, read the book, they've all used sort of the same words, like disturbing and scary, which, you know, it can be. But as I said, all I can do is sort of relate the belief system, and it is a belief system. You know, the group admitted they didn't have proof of this theory. It was a belief system derived from interviewing people and putting strands together, like the Parsons story and things like that, and Crowley. But they concluded that the human race and the Earth, we're not seeing the bigger picture, that the bigger picture is that the Earth is a farm, and that when we die, that yes, the human soul can go somewhere, but they have the ability to kind of, in simple terms, like siphon it off and feed on it in a form of energy. And that this again, one of the reasons why they came to this conclusion was because they interviewed a number of people who claimed to have seen what they described as these huge soul factories. And that was actually one of the files that the group put together, of almost, you know, like souls just never ending in, you know, some other realm where these entities would just kind of hover over them, and this light would come out and feed them. Now again, you know, to not worry, because there's no proof that's true. There's no proof at all. It's a belief system based on witness testimony and interpretation of the evidence. Now, on this particular line though, this guy, Joe Jordan, Joe is a safety inspector at the NASA's Kennedy Space Center. And he had developed an interest in UFOs and began to focus upon the whole issue of alien abductions. And the further he got into it, he became convinced that what he first thought was like a genetic experiment involving aliens involved something else. And I'm just going to read you a few quotes. I interviewed Joe for the book, and this is what he told me.